into a cavernous silence as Chris Brown's voice faded. For a moment, breath hung suspended in the air, every ear strained. Every eye locked on the man who had just shattered the illusion of celebrity power with a single admission. "You're the reason my life fell apart." The judge called the courtroom to order. No one moved, not the press, not the jury, not the defense. Chris remained seated, his chest rising and falling with deliberate calm. It was as if he'd anchored the entire room with his confession. "Mr. Brown, thank you for your testimony. You've shared deeply personal and painful experiences. You said your truth mattered more than your reputation. Was it worth it?" The prosecutor asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Chris replied, "because if I can speak, maybe someone else will be brave enough too. Maybe the next kid won't walk in blind." He stood slowly, eyes sweeping the jury before focusing on the defense table. He drew a breath and offered one final message. "I'm not broken, I'm free." A hush settled over the courtroom as the judge called a short recess. Murmurs rippled, like a breeze before a storm. The jury, pressed into their seats, wore expressions of solemn reflection. The press sat in stunned silence, struggling for words to describe the weight of what they'd just witnessed. Defense counsel huddled quietly around Diddy, who remained still, panic flickering briefly behind a mask of calm. Outside the courtroom, reporters jostled at the press line, attempting to distill the sentencing into headlines. "Chris Brown testifies, darkness behind fame exposed." Artists in shock as secret power plays go public. But inside those walls, what stood out most was the raw courage of one man stripping away the veneer of fame to reveal a room full of fear and manipulation. The jury returned, silently taking their seats, eyes still fixed on Chris, still processing the gravity of his testimony. The judge resumed the session, voice steady but eyes heavy, as the room braced. Diddy's legal team prepared for cross-examination, but everyone sensed the shift. The courtroom's power dynamic had changed. Silence no longer protected. Truth carried weight. What happens next? Will the defense attempt to discredit Chris's narrative? Will other former associates step forward now that the dam has broken? And how will the jury reconcile brilliance and brokenness, fame, and fear? This was more than courtroom drama, it was a reckoning. A witness laid bare the human cost of power, dismantling the walls of an empire built on silence. The trial now stands at a crossroads. Will it address accountability, or will the system continue to shield the powerful? Let me know if you'd like me to explore the defense's cross-examination, the media fallout, or the ripple effects within the music industry next. The courtroom door creaked back open, and a hush settled like a shroud. The judge signaled for everyone to take their seats. The air was heavy. The next chapter of this revelation was about to unfold. The prosecutor rose, eyes tracking Chris as he stood calmly in the witness box. "Mr. Brown, someone testified that your revelations have fractured the facade of an empire built on silence. In your experience, has this kind of reckoning ever happened before?" The question held the weight of consequence, the room bracing for the answer. Chris exhaled slowly, his voice steady, echoing through the chamber. "Not like this. People whisper, file complaints, move on in secret, but no one has done this under oath." He looked at the jury. "This is how it starts. It's not just speaking truth, it's saying it where it matters. This room, on the record." A reporter scribbled furiously as Chris continued. "The system protects itself. Contracts, agreements, hush deals, they all say you'll never tell. But we're in a courtroom. You can't NDA this. You can't hush this." A judge interrupted softly. "Mr. Brown, can you testify to the effect this had on your ability to speak out before today?" Chris shook his head, and the memory washed over him like distant thunder. "Fear, guilt, shame. I loved music, wanted to prove I belonged, but every time I tried to voice something even quietly, there was an echo behind it. Something moved, like strings pulling me back. So I shut up. I compartmentalized, I kept singing while drowning inside." Another hush. Even Diddy shifted, chin dipping slightly for the first time since this started. Chris's shoulders straightened. "But I'm not anymore. My voice is still shaking, but it's finally being heard." The defense attorney rose, calm, controlled. "Mr. Brown, your testimony has been powerful, dramatic, emotional. But do you have proof? Texts, recordings, witnesses?" The tone was clinical. Chris met the attorney's gaze directly. "I've submitted some," he said, nodding once toward his folder. "But this isn't just about what I can hold in my hand. It's about what I lived, and what others lived. I'm not here to stage a show, I'm here because the system needs witnesses." The defense pressed. "So you're saying you kept quiet for years, but now you speak only because you saw headlines?" Chris didn't flinch. "No, I'm speaking because I realized headlines are empty without accountability. Because people died quiet. Because careers died quiet. And because now I know that speech in this room becomes a record. The kind they can't sweep away." A murmur traveled through the courtroom. The judge called for silence again. Chris looked at the jury, his gaze steady and determined. "You all came here to hear truth. Whether it's uncomfortable, whether it stains, What we thought we knew, this is real. Not entertainment, not rumor. The judge held his look for a moment. Very well. We'll pause for a short recess. Court will reconvene in 20 minutes. As his gavel came down, eyes shifted. The foundation had cracked again this time. Deeper. Observers exited in hushed tones. Reporters set their recorders on silent. Cameras flickered with low hum. Defense attorneys conferred in tight circles, flipping through notes. But in the stillest corner, Chris remained hands folded, eyes forward, exhaling as if releasing years of held breath. The trial had turned into more than legal proceedings. It had become a confrontation with silence, with hidden truth. And Chris Brown's voice had surfaced the fractures. Now everyone waiting would see if they would fill them in and if justice would emerge in the gaps. Let me know if you'd like to explore how the defense responds, post-assess, the media impact, or possible additional witnesses stepping forward. The courtroom reconvened after the brief recess, the tension nearly palpable. Chris remained at the stand, his composure a stark contrast to the gravity of what he'd just revealed. The judge opened the session by reminding everyone of the heavy burden before them. Weighing one man's testimony against another's legacy, the defense attorney began a pointed line of questioning, seeking to unpack inconsistencies. Mr. Brown, he asked, you say you documented events, yet you admit some memories stem from rumors and fear. How can we know which parts are factual and which are perceived? Chris's expression didn't falter. What I told you today, he said, I lived. I still have the documents. The fear, the calls, the messages, you all will see them. His assurance carried uncompromising conviction. As the day unfolded, more witnesses were called. One was a former assistant who provided corroboration for Chris's claims of hidden cameras and enforced silences behind the scenes. Another was a private investigator who detailed off the record incident deals, hush money payments indirectly tied to Diddy's network. Even a studio manager testified to seeing rooms sealed off during private gatherings, locked down like secure sets. Media outlets outside the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Tweets began trending names from the trial. Journalists compared Chris's testimony to the previous bombshell from Jay-Z. Collectively, these testimonies formed a narrative echoing abuse of power within the entertainment industry. In court, the defense shifted strategies. They stressed Diddy's lack of criminal charges related to these specific events, pushing the argument that memory on trauma can be distorted. But even as they questioned emotional perception, the growing number of supporting voices lent strength to the claims. Mid-afternoon, a new witness took the stand. A lawyer once contracted by Diddy's team to arrange non-disclosure agreements for attendees. Under oath, she confirmed that a standard practice involved binding privacy protections whenever guests entered private estates. She admitted she'd drafted hundreds of such agreements, potentially covering situations of a troubling nature. Her testimony resonated as validation. These contracts weren't for music projects. They were for silence. By the end of the day, both prosecution and defense rested before the jury. What began as a legal battle over alleged crimes had morphed into a reckoning with industry culture. Diddy's team portrayed it as a campaign of rumor and revenge. The prosecution framed it as a pattern of abuse hidden under celebrity and fear. As jurors left for deliberation, the courtroom felt different, like a space forever marked by voices that refused to stay silent. The weight of testimony from Jay-Z and Chris Brown, combined with the corroborating evidence, had shifted the narrative irreversibly. The next day, headlines would read, "Witnesses expose culture of control." But inside that courtroom, the real question lingered. Would these revelations be enough to hold the empire accountable? The courtroom lights dimmed as the bailiff announced, "All rise," and the judge re-entered, carrying the weight of the room's collective breath. Everyone returned to their seats, the jurors, defiant witnesses, anxious attorneys poised at the edge of tomorrow's decision. Outside, news crews assembled like a swarm, the echoes of Jay-Z and Chris Brown's testimonies still rippling. Across the globe, reporters whispered about the seismic shock. Two of the industry's most powerful voices, speaking openly in court, exposing a culture once believed untouchable. Inside, jurors whispered quietly among themselves, their faces inscrutable. Some wore the hollow look of having carried a burden far beyond instructions. Others seemed resolute, as though their responsibility had found deeper meaning. Diddy sat motionless at the defense table. His legal team conferred in low tones, records shuffled quietly. But he himself kept his gaze forward, expression blank, reaction, no defiance, but the slightest quiver at the corners of his mouth. Then, as if on cue, a hush fell. The judge stood again. He rested both hands on the bench and said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, tomorrow you begin your deliberations. You must decide whether the evidence as presented supports the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. You have heard powerful testimony from witnesses who held influence in that world, Jay-Z, Chris Brown, a world built on fame and fear. You have heard accounts of manipulation, surveillance, threats, and coercion." He paused, eyes sweeping over each juror. "This case is not centered on gossip. It is centered on the land, whether that law has been violated. When you retire to deliberate, you must weigh each claim carefully. Determine the credibility of each witness. Examine the documents, the messages, the recordings, they are pieces of a larger picture. Before dismissing the jury, he emphasized one final point. Under the law, Diddy or any defendant is innocent until proven guilty. But the jury's oath is to base its verdict on the evidence, not the man behind the music. With that, the judge recessed the court. The bailiff escorted the jury out. As they passed, their expressions unreadable, the courtroom breathed again. Spectators stirred. Phones lit up. Whispers resumed. Outside, the media already buzzed. Deliberations tomorrow. Inside, the legal teams gathered their files. The prosecution appeared confident, the defense guarded but steady. And Diddy, one larger than life, sat with a kind of fragile calm, his empire balanced on the edge of a verdict that could redefine everything. That night, the courthouse stood quiet under streetlights. Cameras packed away. The echoes of justice and truth lingered in the halls like a challenge. Would centuries of silence finally be shattered? Tomorrow, the jurors would decide. The following morning, as sunlight filtered through courthouse windows, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Jurors filed in silently, faces drawn but resolute. Every seat was filled. Reporters, families, supporters, all waiting for one thing: the verdict. The judge entered and called the court to order. "Madam Foreperson," he said, "has the jury reached a unanimous decision?" A woman stood, clutching the verdict slip in trembling hands. "We have, Your Honor." She handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. He unfolded the paper, his face unreadable. Then he read the verdict aloud. On the charge of criminal coercion and abuse of power, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to suppress victims and evidence, guilty. On the charge of surveillance and manipulation for personal gain, guilty. Gasps filled the room. A sob. A reporter's pen dropped to the floor. Chris Brown, sitting in the gallery now, closed his eyes as if finally exhaling after a decade of holding his breath. Jay-Z, who had returned to witness the verdict, nodded solemnly, not in triumph, but in closure. Diddy remained still. His hands gripped the defense table, jaw clenched. The man who once moved entire arenas now sat in silence, his empire cracking audibly around him. The judge turned to him. "You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Sentencing will follow. Until then, you are remanded into custody." Officers moved to escort him. The once unreachable mogul rose slowly, as if his legacy had become an anchor too heavy to carry. As he was led out, his eyes flickered toward Chris, toward Jay-Z. Words, only the hollow echo of a reputation imploding. Outside, the crowd erupted not in joy, but in release. The truth had come to light. Justice, for once, had found its way into the heart of power. And from that day forward, no one would forget what had happened in that courtroom, not because a celebrity was tried, but because the silence had finally been broken. Forever.